All right, and we are live on YouTube. And I will now let folks in, as I usually do. If I can just figure out how this works again. There we go. And go. Good evening, everybody. If you're just joining, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're just getting started, just opening the doors. Let people in, take a few minutes.
Open the chat.
Good idea. If you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're just getting started. Takes a few minutes to let everybody in. Welcome. I hope that wind isn't gusting to 50 miles an hour as just got this alert.
Mm.
Hope it doesn't mess up our communication.
This is a good resource.
Good. We'll get started in just a few minutes, folks. This is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Thanks for joining. We'll give it one more minute. Counting down. Okay, let's get started. All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Losack. I'm co-founder, executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. For those of you who don't know us, we are the first and only regional nonprofit dedicated exclusively to renter outreach, education, organizing, and advocacy. If anybody needs to contact us for guidance or information, they can get in touch with us at info@rentersalliance.org. And maybe one of my staff can remind me of what the 888 number is, put that in the chat too. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the fundamentals of renters' rights that people often forget, especially property managers and landlords. So we thought we'd go through all of those. But also we thought at the beginning, we would just talk about a couple of things that have been happening around town. I'd like to remind everybody that if you have a question or concern, please put it in the chat and we will address it as we go. Later on in the discussion, we will have with us Carlton Martin, a housing attorney with the Homeless Persons Representation Project. He should be joining us in about 20 minutes to half an hour. And then we'll get into some of the basic rights that people have, and we'll answer your questions. Attorney Martin will remind us of this, but he will not be able to address and give legal advice. He'll only be able to give his opinion in general about the law, but he has to actually meet with you individually and discuss cases privately in order to give legal advice. So he will not be doing that tonight. So if you have a case and you have a concern, getting his legal advice specifically on that, he will not be able to do. But what he will be able to do is to address the laws. He knows it, and some of the processes that impact us as we pursue our rights or disputes with property managers, landlords, or pursuing other types of resources with nonprofit, private, and government agencies. But what's going on is that if anybody's been following our newsletter, last night in Gaithersburg, was it last night? Yeah, Monday night rather. The Gaithersburg Council and Mayor held a hearing.
No, in Rockville.
Pardon me?
In Rockville, not
in Rockville. I keep getting my Rockvilles and Gaithersburgs mixed up. Rockville held a hearing on how to stabilize housing costs in Rockville. And part of the discussion omitted any allowance of a discussion of rent stabilization, which of course infuriated nearly half of the residents of Gaithersburg who lived there, who were beseeching passionately the council members to consider a rent stabilization program.
Of Rockville, Matt, of Rockville.
In Rockville. I keep mixing it up, sorry. Talking about Rockville. We'll talk about Gaithersburg in a minute, but Rockville, that's where the hearing was. And two of the members of the council, Isola Shaw and Dr. Miles, are very pro rent stabilization, but were outvoted by the other four or so council members and the mayor. The room was packed, and there were two overflow rooms with renters, young and old, professional, non-professional, couples with children, senior citizens who are desperately seeking some kind of remedy that balances the interest of a landlord, which is perfectly legitimate, to maintain his or her profit margin when they charge rent, and to keep up with legitimately related expenses with running the apartment. But that has to be balanced with a tenant's right to have predictable, stable rents. And in Montgomery County, as many of you all will recall, we were seeing and are seeing in some places rents, exceeding 3%, going up to 5%, 10%, 20%. We've seen rents as high as 210% increases prior to Montgomery County passing its own rent stabilization law, which finally took effect last July. And that limits rents to 6% or 3% plus the consumer price index for urban areas. And right now that's 3% plus 3.3%, but it's capped at 6% this year. Hopefully the CPIU will come down again next year, and then it's either 6% or the formula, whichever is lower. Unfortunately, that our bill in Montgomery County is a modest bill. We were not happy with it. We're pleased that there was progress, but we wanted to see something a little bit more appropriate in terms of the rent cap at around 3%, which would have made more sense. We were also not happy with two amendments put in by Councilmember Don Lutke, one that exempted apartment buildings built in the last 23 years. So if your apartment building was built 22 years ago, it still has one more year of exemption. If it was built this year, it has 23 years of exemption. We understood and supported the principle behind that, which is that if you're going to spend $100, $200 million to build an apartment building, you should be sure you're going to make your money back and make a profit. Okay, we're just not sure it takes 23 years to do that. So we thought the number was excessive and that there should have been a more reasonable approach to that, like say 5 or 10 years, come back to us and show us what your books say and whether or not you've made your money back and made a reasonable profit, whatever that was proposed to be. The other amendment, which we considered a poison amendment, was the exemption of small landlords that had 2 or fewer units. There are thousands of tenants in Montgomery County who live in condos or single homes or a single apartment let by a small landlord. And we feel that a small landlord should have the same responsibilities as a large landlord to provide stable, quality housing to people. So we're not pleased with not happy with the total legislation, but at least we knew it was a step forward. But in Rockville and Gaithersburg, which are independent municipalities within Montgomery County, they have no such protection. And so they are still seeing the Wild West of rent increases that are creating a forced migration of working and low-income families, many of them long-term residents of these municipalities in our county, who don't know where they're going to go and are being priced out of their homes. Many of them very vulnerable people as well, people with disabilities, people on fixed incomes, senior citizens who've lived in their homes for decades, and they're just not sure where they're going to go. So we found it rather unconscionable that Rockville, given that half of the residents in Rockville live in rental housing, and they were ignored when it came to this policy discussion. But we keep the faith, and we have met with every one of the council members in Rockville individually, and we know that they are smart people, and we know that they have, they have a heart. We hope that that heart beats a little bit stronger for renters, and that they start opening their eyes and ears to the testimony that was given passionately Monday night by a whole host of people. It's true there are some extreme folks who had extreme things to say, and maybe they are not taken as seriously as others, but there are a whole bunch of folks, the vast majority of folks who gave testimony that were quite reasonable, quite impassioned, quite grown up, quite respectful of the landlord industry's right to maintain a profit margin and keep up with legitimate expenses. Nobody had a problem with that except for a small group. And it would be quite something if the elected officials only interpreted the more radical views against and ignored the majority, which was quite reasonable. So pressure is on. You can watch the testimony. If you got our newsletter, you can link up to the testimony that evening and see how impassioned and reasonable the testimony was. We'll keep the pressure on. Rockville is an outlier, and so is Gaithersburg. Josh Fisher, who's with us tonight, and I should introduce everybody. Josh Fisher is the treasurer of our board. Pat Beckham is on staff here, Malek Demir also on staff, and Emily Towie is one of our full-time outreach coordinators. But Josh, what is your take on where we are with Gaithersburg's rent stabilization program?
Well, I think, thank you, Matt. Good evening, everybody. So to answer your question, Matt, I will say that we need to put more pressure on the Gaithersburg Council. I feel that there are more pro-rent stabilization members on the Rockville City Council than there are in Gaithersburg, and I think that is just a testament of Rockville perhaps progressing a lot quicker than Gaithersburg is. That's not to say that we won't get there, but we definitely have to put more pressure on Gaithersburg folks than on Rockville. Though we have to put pressure on both. Folks, I would actually just to say that even if you don't live within the municipalities, it's always good if you are a pro rent stabilization to send an email to the Rockville City Council and the Gaithersburg City Council And the Gaithersburg City Council is at City Hall at GaithersburgMD.gov. That's City Hall at GaithersburgMD.gov. I am in the process of trying to get the email address for Rockville. As soon as we do, I'll put that in the chat as well. Matt?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so it's been quite the struggle. By the way, Tacoma Park is also an independent municipality, but Tacoma Park has had rent stabilization since 1981. Part of that was because of then a Tacoma Park council member, Mark Elrich, who was a champion for that in Tacoma Park, and then took that fight to the county council where he was all alone, with us, but he was on the council, the only member really supporting renters' rights. And then things have changed. One of the things that has changed in a big way is the demographic. We've gone from 23% renter in Montgomery County in 2007 to about nearly 40% now. And many of those renters are working class and middle class folks and senior citizens, a growing number, who are very active in politics and pay attention and vote. So the council started to reflect that, and we got some measure of rent stabilization passed. And the same thing I predict is going to happen in Gaithersburg and Rockville eventually. But it's too bad for the tenants now who are not protected by Montgomery County housing laws, but by the housing laws that are in each of those municipalities. And that lacks rent stabilization. So I testified again on Monday in Gaithersburg, as did scores of other renters. But we also, on the state level, are very concerned about a lack of just cause eviction protection. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, right now in the state of Maryland, with just 60 days notice at the end of your lease, a landlord could say, we're not going to renew. And they don't have to provide any reason at all not to renew the lease. And that can hide a whole lot of abuse. They can be retaliating against you for pursuing promised or required services in your building, filing a complaint to the code department or to landlord tenant for discrimination because of the color of your skin or your gender or your sexual preference, whatever it is. They can hide that because they don't have to say why they're renewing the lease, not renewing the lease. And if you stay one day longer than the lease term after they've given you 60 days notice, then you're what's called tenant holding over. You've held over one day longer than the lease. And then the landlord can sue you to evict you in court, and there is little or no defense. The only thing that the judge will ask is whether or not you got the proper notice. And if you got the 60-day notice, then you could say, hey, look, they're discriminating against me. You have to be able to prove it. How are you going to prove it if the landlord doesn't have to say why they did not renew the lease? Just cause eviction protection would require a landlord to renew a lease absent a justifiable reason. So there are obviously justifiable reasons. The landlord can always evict a tenant for failing to pay the rent or abusing the property or breaking the law or any other common sense kind of thing that any reasonable person would say, if you do those things or you fail to keep up your end of the bargain in the lease, then you're not going to be able to stay here any longer and you could be forced out of your home. But at least the landlord would have to state that reason in order not to renew the lease. And then there are some other legitimate reasons aside from bad behavior that also include business reasons. For example, a small landlord might say that the upstairs apartment in my house is no longer available because I'm going to lease it to my mother-in-law who's going to move in with us, or my daughter who's coming back from college. That could be a legitimate reason. Could also be for a large or small landlord that repairs are going to have to be made in the building to such an extent that the apartment or apartments are not going to be habitable any longer or for a lengthy period of time. That could be a reason, but they have to state why. Now, they can't just come up with those reasons to get rid of you and then not do what they say they're going to do. But there has to be some kind of stated justification. we think that a person's home is important. It relates to the stability of your home, relates to your ability to participate in the economic, social, political life of your communities. It has to do with an individual's health and welfare, and for that matter, our overall prosperity. When you have unstable communities, unstable housing, people don't invest in the community like they would if they were stable and long-term. And despite the arguments of many landlord associations and the landlords themselves that people in stabilized apartments don't care about their apartments, it's actually not true. It's just the opposite. When your building is your home, I know this because I've done it myself. I've been here in my building for 20 years. And my grandmother, who lived in her building for almost 70 years, was the head of her tenants association, but she cared about what was going on 3 floors below if somebody left garbage in the hallway. They knew about it. If the washing machines weren't working properly, they were on it because the entire community was their home, and it was a permanent home. So that's the importance of having rent stabilization and just cause eviction protection is directly related to the health, welfare, and prosperity of our overall communities. Any questions on any of that from folks? Then let me just quickly turn to Emily Towie, who was also testifying on behalf of the Renters Alliance at the Montgomery County delegation. That's our state elected officials delegations for the House of Delegates and the Senate also Monday night. We were all over the place.
Yeah, so last year, Just Cause was proposed by our good friend, Delegate Janelle Wilkins, who's a Montgomery County delegate, and it passed in the House, not made it out of committee, and then passed in the House 96 to 37. But the Senate didn't take it for a vote. So we didn't get to see what the actual numbers were there in the Senate, but we saw that it made really good progress to the House. So we're hopeful that this year, the Senate will take their lead and call the bill for a vote. I see our guest has just joined us. Hi, Carlton. Just really quickly, Just Cause goes hand in hand with all the other renter issues. Something else I talked about was that we talk about a lot on here is organizing rights, the right to establish tenant associations. And without Just Cause, a lot of times tenant association members face retaliation. If they're the president or, they complain, they're the ones who organize the building and they were distributing flyers, put them on the landlord's radar, and then they get hit with the non-renewal notice. There's not a lot to do there. It's hard to prove retaliation when you don't have to provide a reason to non-renew. So that's our priority for this upcoming legislative session. We hope that the Montgomery County delegation thinks it's a priority too. I'll turn it over to Matt.
Right, and before I introduce our guest, just to address the question, there's no incentive to evict or non-renewal because the rent cap would still apply to the apartment. So it's not like they could evict and then raise the rents. They can't. They still have to stick to the rent stabilization cap. So they lose that incentive. But we're seeing a whole lot of other abuse of going after tenants for forming tenants associations and for complaining about not getting promised or required services and so on. So with that, we'll continue with our discussions on upcoming legislation and Just Cause at future town halls. Of course, we always expect everyone listening and all of your friends and neighbors to stay engaged. There used to be that people viewed the tenants as sort of second-class citizens who don't participate in the political, social, economic life of the community, but are sort of temporary. We know that's not true, as evidenced by what's already taken place in Montgomery County. So stay engaged. But with that, let me welcome Carlton Martin, who is a housing attorney with the Homeless Persons Representation Project, which is one of the organizations that's part of the Access to Counsel in Evictions program, which we're also promoting with the Renters Alliance, which includes CASA and legal aid. And Carlton's going to join us to give not legal advice, which he cannot give individually, but to certainly give his expert opinion as we go through some of these basic rights that we know in Montgomery County that renters have. But Carlton, why don't you say a little bit about yourself, and welcome.
Thank you for the invitation, Matt, and thank you everybody for being here. Apologize for my lateness. I've been running around. I actually was in court today, and just made it back to get settled in. So, and excuse my dress. I took all the tie and all that stuff off, but I wanted to get nice and comfortable. And just to let you all know, this is an informal conversation. I didn't want it to be too stuffy. My background, there's a couple things I want to reveal. I'm new to Maryland. All right. In my background, I've been licensed to practice law since 2013, but I was licensed to practice in the state of Indiana. That's where I spent about 2013 to about, almost close to 2020 out there. I was a public defender, doing post-conviction relief cases. So I'm kind of on the criminal side. But I also was a legal aid attorney coming out of law school, where I worked on housing matters. I worked on expungement law, and I worked on consumer matters, family law, a bunch of other types of things in Indiana. And then I also worked for the Indiana Supreme Court in a role where we were trying to oversee. What my role was to help with making the access to justice programs better for people in the state. So how to make it more accessible, how to look at the system, see where the gaps were, and see where those gaps could be filled. I'm gonna talk about that gap real quickly at the end of my introduction. When I came out here, I worked for an organization in Washington, D.C. called the National Homelessness Law Center. I was the pro bono director, did a bunch of stuff there. And so now I am here in this capacity, which I say new to learning the housing law, but I'm not new to the housing world, from a global perspective, from a national perspective. I think that one thing that I like to tell people, right, and you're probably already well aware of this, when it comes to legal aid, there's a report that you can get out there from the Legal Services Corporation. Well, I don't remember what it's called. It's called the GAP. If you can look it up, it's called the GAP. The last one I'm aware of is from 2019. There might be a new one, especially after COVID. But what they found in this study was that over 90% of people who go to Legal Services Corporation funded legal aid or organizations, over 90% of them leave unserved, right? So that means when you go there, you have a legal issue, you're not able to get fully served, right? So getting an attorney to represent you and litigate it fully through, or file the paperwork, or et cetera. So the overwhelming majority of people who go there are turned away. The reason, it's not because people don't want to help, right? It's not because they're just turning people away just to be turning people away. It's the system. There's a lack of resources. There are not many attorneys like myself. In Indiana, I was one of maybe 100 or so that did legal services work full time. And one person can have 20 legal problems, right? And so you multiply that by millions of people. And so that's where we are in the country when it comes to this type of work. And it's not an excuse, but there are tremendous gaps. So today, I hope that I can provide some practical information about how to prepare for court, but not even just for court, but really to be proactive, so that when you find yourself in a situation that you have your stuff together and you're kind of ready to combat what's to come. So that's it.
Thank you, Carlton. We're going to do what the Renters Alliance loves to do, and just sort of kibitz. We're going to go through our renters' rights here, and if you hear us say something wrong, which is entirely possible, especially for me, then please correct us. And if you have some wisdom or experience that you think will be value added to as we go through these rights, please let us know. And then I'd like to turn it back to you. We've given you some questions about process and what people can expect if they have to go to court, or what your advice might be if they have generally want to pursue a remedy. That would be really helpful. So I thought we would start. Emily and I are going to do this together, and I thought we'd start with a sort of a basic right that most people don't realize, but a landlord cannot just come into your home unless it's an emergency. They have to give you at least 24 hours notice, and in Montgomery County, and in 72 hours notice prior to an annual or triennial inspection by the county. So they have to give you some kind of notice, at least 24 hours in advance, but also if it is inconvenient for you, reasonably inconvenient, you can negotiate that they enter at a better time. We've seen, for example, a landlord gave 24 hours notice on Christmas Eve to come in on Christmas Day to do some kind of a work or inspection in the apartment. And the person who lived there had family there, and it was Christmas Day, and they didn't want them there. That was perfectly reasonable for them to object. The other thing is that even though they say they've given you notice in 24 hours, the landlord still cannot barge into your apartment if you don't want them to come in, unless it's an emergency, a serious, an emergency by any reasonable standard. It's your private space, and you can prevent them from coming in, with the one caveat that if you say you can't come in and they've given you reasonable notice, 24 hours, they could sue you for breach of lease, and then go after you saying that you are not allowing us to come in when we need to come in, and they could try to evict you on that basis. But in between a court order and that time, it is your private space, and no one can just barge into your house or push past you. Carlton, would that be breaking and entry if they tried to do that?
If they've tried to come in without giving you 24 hours notice.
Well, say you're at the door and you said, look, it's I don't want you coming in now. And they say, well, they gave you 24 hours notice. And you say, well, I don't want you coming in now. And they push past you into your apartment. What would that be?
You know, it's not that clear cut, because that's entering into criminal law. So you know, there in criminal law, you always got to look at intent and or what's called mens rea. You know, your intent, the mindset state to commit a crime. So breaking and entering, probably not, but
maybe trespass
could be trespassing. But again, it's the intent part that can provide a hurdle for you. But even I like that you asked that question, because I don't want, if I'm jumping ahead, then stop me. But you want to think of, like, any time you're talking about legal, like going to court, right? You need to think about the long game as well as the short-term game in terms of what you have to gain. So in the situation where you're living in an apartment, or you're living somewhere and you're dealing with the landlord that you have a contract with or lease with, you know, when it comes to things like calling the police or involving the courts, you just want to, I'm not to scare people away, that's your right, but you want to be more strategic and try to make a clear-headed decision about when to do that, because, you know, you want to not just to protect that relationship, but you want to position yourself in the best position possible to have a relationship to where you're going to get what you want out of the landlord. Because a lot of stuff is not about just fighting to be fighting. Like, think about, how do I get what I want? So you may not want to bite the bullet at that time, but if it's in the best interest of ultimately getting what you want, you need to think about that just from a perspective. So in that scenario, you know, just think twice before calling the police, but make note of it. We'll come back to that later.
No, I think that's a really important point, and thanks for moderating. We're so used to dealing with tenants with horror stories that usually we start there in these conversations. But you're absolutely right, Carlton, that we don't want to start off with a adversarial or hostile relationship with a property manager or a landlord. That's not the intent. But we do think people should understand that they have a right to quiet enjoyment of their private space, and should feel that way. That's not to say there aren't compromises that should be made if a landlord is acting in good faith and needs to come in or wants to come in or so on. But when you hit a gray area, you could always reach out to us and we could provide that counsel on what we think. And we probably will support exactly what Carlton is saying about, well, was this the time to throw down the gauntlet, or did they just want to come in and look at the pipe or whatever that they were trying to do? But it is your private space. You are entitled to 24 hours notice at least, and 72 hours if there is a county inspection coming in, which gives you a little bit more lead time to reach out to the county code inspector and say if there's a problem in your apartment or in the building that you want them to look at. Emily, what are we doing about leases? Can you take a look there?
Yes, so when when you're first moving in, you have a right to receive a copy of the landlord tenant handbook. Unless you don't want the paper copy, you can decline and use the online copy, but they should offer one to you. And they should also you you also have the right to review a copy of your lease before signing. Sometimes we hear from tenants that they they didn't get to see a copy and they signed, and later on there was some kind of stipulation they weren't aware of. So it's good practice to always read over the lease before you sign it.
Absolute mole.
And oh,
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna move on to breaking your lease, but did you
Go
have
ahead.
something?
No, please do.
Okay. Um, so then when it comes to breaking your lease, something we hear a lot is tenants who want to break their lease early. So breaking your lease early, basically there's two kinds of situations. Reasons beyond the tenant's control and reasons within the tenant's control. So beyond your control would be like a death in the family of like a major wage earner, um like unemployment, a serious illness, something like that that was beyond your control. The other kind within your control would be like, I just got married and I just want to move into a bigger house, or I'm something within your control. So for situations that are out of your control, you can break your lease if you provide 30 days notice, but the landlord is allowed to impose a penalty not to exceed, correct me if I'm wrong, Carlton, not to exceed one month's rent, as long as you provide proper notice. And the more notice you can give them, the better, so that they can, look to re-rent your unit. But when it's something within your control, you just want to move out, you want to upgrade to a bigger place, you want to move out of state, you want to move to Hawaii, something like that. For that, it's a little more complicated. So you can still try to break your lease, but the landlord can impose a larger penalty. So it's if my lease is up in June and right now it's November and I want to move out in December. Well, that's 6 months that the landlord had expected to collect rent from me, that they're now not going to be able to. So something you can do is you can try subletting your unit out, and finding a tenant, to take over your unit. And the landlord can only object like if you find a good tenant without like major problems on their background, they should accept them, but they also have the right to not accept a tenant if they have a really bad credit score, if they have a criminal record, something like that. So within reason, if you provide them with a good candidate to take over your lease, they should legitimately consider that. um but and the law is like a little unclear here to me, but my understanding is that so when it's something beyond, oh sorry, within your control, like you just want to move somewhere else, the more notice you can provide them, the better. But you could potentially be responsible for covering the rent until they release it. So my lease ends in June, and the landlord doesn't find, but I move out in December. The landlord doesn't find someone to fill my unit till March. I believe that I could still be responsible for December. I could still be responsible for January and February until that new tenant comes in.
I think the way it works, Carlton, maybe you could weigh in here is, first of all, if there's a clause in the lease that says what your penalty would be. So there could be that if you break the lease, you will be responsible for 3 months or 90 days or whatever it is, and then the lease is operating. Or if you're going to break the lease and it's not specified in the lease, that you may be responsible for the entirety of the remainder of the leasing period, unless you can find a tenant that's suitable, as Emily points out, and also that the landlord has to look in good faith to also offer the apartment out, and that they can't double dip. So they can't charge you and charge another tenant that they've got to fill the apartment at the same time. Is that about right, Carlton, or other points?
I need to look into the second scenario further, where you said the lease doesn't specify, but the lease is going to dictate, it's going to govern this situation primarily because it's a contract. If there's some sort of provision I might not be aware of in Montgomery County specifically, that would kick in if the lease doesn't say, if that might be out there, I'm not aware. But look to your lease to see what the terms are for all of this stuff, but to look to your lease to see what the terms are for breaking the lease early.
Yeah, that's in 99% of the situation, it's going to be the lease. I don't know. I've never seen a lease that didn't have a termination clause in it. But if it didn't, for any reason, they could say, listen, you signed a contract that you're going to be here till June. You expect you to pay until June. The only ways to shorten that up is if it's beyond your control. And if it is beyond your control, by the way, we highly recommend that you not leave unilaterally, but that you have a communication with the landlord that you are leaving. You've given 30 days notice, that your husband or spouse has lost the breadwinner and lost their job, or you can, for medical reasons, have to leave, or some other issue beyond your control. The county law does allow for breaking the lease with 30 days notice, but we ask that you do that by consulting in writing with the landlord. If they don't respond in writing and agree, then to file a complaint with the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, so that you have a written understanding between yourself and the property manager or landlord before you do that. Don't do anything unilaterally. Stop paying your rent and skip out. You might find yourself extremely vulnerable to being pursued for a debt.
Can I add something, Matt?
Sure.
I just put a link in the chat from the Department of Housing Community Affairs. They have a little information on terminating the lease early, and for reasons within the tenant's control, like we talked about, you get married or you're buying a house, moving out. DHCA, the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, they recommend that if you are looking into subleasing your unit, that you contact the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs to make sure that subletting is allowed in that specific situation. So that's just if you're trying to break the lease early and you're thinking about subletting, DHCA recommends that you reach out to them. And Malek just put in the chat how you can get in contact with Landlord Tenant Affairs, and we can also help connect you to them if you're having trouble. And sorry, we had another question in the chat. I think this had to do with maintenance. Someone asked what counts as delivery notice. Their landlord leaves notices on their door, but sometimes they don't go outside every day, so they wouldn't realize until they went outside. They want to know if notice given counts as when they deliver on the door or when the person actually sees it. And my guess would be that it's when they deliver it. Even if even if you didn't go outside, they still gave you the notice.
Yeah, and of course they did it in a reasonable way. They didn't give you notice and leave it on the roof of the building. They left it where you live. So, a reasonable person would say they gave you reasonable notice through a reasonable method.
And two more questions in the chat. Someone asked if the landlord I think it's about subletting. If the landlord finds someone to rent out the unit before you, are you still liable? And no. When the unit is re-rented out, the rental obligation of the previous tenant ceases. So you are now relieved. Now that someone, like Matt said, they can't double dip and collect from you and the new tenant at the same time, which has to do with someone else's question. Are there instances where the management company dawdles in preparing the rental unit for a new tenant? So I can assume that there are instances like that, but DHCA says that, or the Department of Housing and Community Affairs says that the landlord must make reasonable attempts to re-rent the property. So I'm sure it happens sometimes, but they're not supposed to just sit there and hope to collect like 6 easy months of rent off a vacant unit. They're supposed to be making reasonable, like honest attempts to re-rent your unit.
And that's unfortunately, the courts are run by human beings, and somebody has to make a judgment as to whether or not they were making reasonable attempts and so on. But that is the principle behind it. All right, let's go on to maintenance. You have a right to have your appliances, including heat and air conditioning, in good working order. These are the things that the landlord is responsible for. You have a right to have repairs done in a reasonable time, health and safety issues promptly. Of course, you have to inform the property management that you need such a repair to take place, but you have the right to that. Right to have your apartment or part of the apartment painted every 5 years. A lot of people don't know that. You have to request it, but after 5 years, you can require that the landlord repaint your apartment, all or part of it. Now, you also have to prepare the apartment for the paint job. That's the tough part. Moving furniture, covering furniture, getting it ready to have it painted. But you do have a right to that every 5 years. And this comes up all the time. What you don't have a right to so far, and the Renters Alliance is fighting for this, but so far the right does not exist, to have your carpets changed. That, unfortunately, you do not have a right to have that changed every period of time. However, if there is a tripping hazard in your carpet because of normal wear and tear, the landlord does have to repair it or replace it. If it is your fault, it's still a code violation, and the landlord has to repair or replace it, but at your expense. So if you've dragged something across the floor and torn up the carpet, it has to be repaired, and it'll be at your expense. This is something that the Renters Alliance fought for in 2015, and we got it passed in the county council. It has been historically in Montgomery County and probably elsewhere in the state that if you wanted a repair done and the landlord wasn't making that repair, that you'd have to go to court and request that the judge put your rent in escrow in order to until the landlord made the repair. And that is extremely cumbersome a process for most people. So what we did is we put in legislation that says if you have a common repair, a leaky toilet, a carpet repair that needs done, something, and the landlord is not doing it, of course, first you're going to reach out to the landlord. Landlord is not responsive. Then you're going to file a code complaint. The code inspector is going to come in, and he or she is going to determine that there's a code violation. And they're going to give the landlord a certain period of time to make that repair. And if they do not, you can request through the code inspector that you have permission to repair it yourself and deduct the cost from the rent. That has to be done in writing, and has to be done in writing through the permission of the code inspector from the Department of Housing and Community Affairs. But that can shorten things up again. However, you can't request repair and deduct for anything that was more expensive than 1 month's rent. So that's the limit of it. But for many of these small repairs that people need done, your microwave hasn't been working and their landlord has refused to replace it, or just has been foot dragging and replacing it, and you filed a complaint and the code inspector comes in and says, this is not working, tells the property manager to fix it, they don't replace it, then you can request from the code inspector that you'll buy a new microwave. It costs $550 or whatever it is, and you want to deduct it from the rent. and the code inspector should give you written permission to do so. Let's see. Emily, let's do notices, renewals, and non-renewals.
Sure, real quick, we have a question about the carpet. What about carpet from a previous tenant? So I'm guessing this is about like if you moved in and your carpet was already 5 years old and then you've lived there, now it's 8 years old. My understanding is it doesn't matter. They are not required to replace the carpet for being old, only if there's a tripping hazard. That's the only circumstance.
That's
Right.
right. And then it's not replace the whole carpet. It's just either repair it or replace the area of the carpet that's a tripping hazard. That's one of the things that you should do before you move into an apartment is take a look-see and see, is this what you want to live on? Is the carpet what you want to live on? You don't like the carpet? Then you could say to the leasing person, hey, look, either replace the carpet or I'm not moving in. So that's your only option in those circumstances for the carpet. A good landlord will renovate the apartment in between tenants, especially if the previous tenant had been there a long time and there's a lot of wear and tear. A good landlord would repaint the apartment, repair everything, make sure the appliances are up to snuff, make sure the carpet looks good and clean, and allow somebody to move in. And if they don't do that, that should tell you something about the property management or the landlord and decide whether or not you want to live in that place or not.
So, talking about notices, so when you're receiving a rent increase, the landlord has to give you at least 90 days notice. And if your building is subject to rent stabilization, like we talked about earlier, meaning that it's older than 23, it was built more than 23 years ago, your landlord owns more than 2 units, and you are not in the city of Gaithersburg or the city of Rockville. Other than that, you should be subject to rent stabilization. Um, so when you get your notice, make sure that a simple check you can do to make sure it's an effective notice. See the date that they delivered it to you, the date that the increase is supposed to go in effect, make sure that's 90 days or longer. And that the increase doesn't exceed 6%. So the 3% plus whatever inflation is this year. But if you see a notice with 7% and you're supposed to be in a stabilized building, you should send that over to the new Office of Rent Stabilization, which is housed in the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, but it's a new office designed to handle these kinds of issues. So yeah, if I receive a notice, I'm in a stabilized building and I receive a notice today saying that next month, December 1st, my rent is going up 4%. I'm gonna need to call. You can call 311 and ask to speak to the rent stabilization office, or you can find them online. Malek just put that in the chat, and let them know that you've received a notice that you do not believe was properly given. And then the other kind of notice, is a non-renewal notice, which has to do what we talked about earlier with the lack of just cause. At the end of my lease, even if I've done nothing wrong, I've been a great tenant, I've lived here for 5 years. All they have to do is give me 60 days notice, letting me know that they will not be renewing my lease. And a same situation there. Make sure that the easiest way to fight that is if they didn't provide you 60 days notice. So if you see they only gave you 20 days notice and they're telling you you need to be out in 20 days, that kind of complaint would go to landlord tenant affairs, which is already in the chat as well.
And ultimately could end up with either Carlton or with legal aid or with CASA as well as a defense.
But sorry, Matt. But if someone receives a lot of times a non-renewal comes with a notice to vacate, but not always, right? So if they don't renew me and I didn't get a notice to vacate, I will automatically go month to month.
That's correct.
And yeah.
Carlton, one question though for you, and maybe this might be splitting hairs, but we have heard that if you're on a month-to-month lease, you might only be required to get 30 days notice, a notice to vacate, or does the Montgomery County 60-day requirement operate here? Do you know?
I've not heard of 30 days for a month to month notices. I'm on only 60.
All right. Well, we'll stick to 60. But when in doubt, reach out to us and we'll take a look at that. But I think it's 60 in Montgomery County.
Because I mean, it's month to month, right? So September to October. It's kind of, if you give me notice, well, I guess it is possible to do, but I would need to think more about that, but I think it's 60.
I think it's 60 in Montgomery County and maybe 30 in the rest of the state. But I believe that these issues came up. Well, let's put an asterisk on that and figure that out. We'll put that out in a future newsletter. Make a note of that.
Sorry, Matt, I just did a quick search on DHCA. The DHCA says that landlords of month-to-month tenants and multifamily units are required to provide at least 60-day notice to the tenant, except in cases of breach of lease. And that generally month-to-month tenants are required themselves to give 60-day notice if they want to vacate, 60-day notice to their landlord. But sometimes a lease might specify in a month-to-month situation that it's longer or shorter. But sounds like 60 is the general
minimum.
unless the lease says otherwise.
It's a minimum. And bear in mind, breach of lease is a completely different scenario. That's if you're breaking the rules of the apartment community, and that is an entirely different process. I'm going to talk a little bit about security deposits, and Carlton weigh in here for sure. I believe that security deposit law is some of the simplest law in Maryland code. But the landlord's supposed to keep your security deposit in a separate bank account. I doubt that they do, but they're supposed to. It's supposed to be an interest-bearing account. And I believe the interest in the last required on security deposits in the last 10 years is 1%. It was larger if your security deposit is over 20 years old. There is a calculator, Malek, if you could put this online, from DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development, that's the state housing department, to calculate the value of your security deposit from when you initially provided it. But they have to provide you interest. You're supposed to receive your security deposit back within 45 days of notice. So a landlord cannot take any part of your security deposit unless they can justify why they're taking that security deposit. So you have to have done some damage. The landlord has to provide you by first-class mail a list of those damages and the actual costs of those damages that justify the deduction from the security deposit. And they have to do that within 45 days of your move out. And they have to send that to your forwarding address. If they fail to do that within 45 days, they lose all right to any part of your security deposit. And it's pretty clear what the law says in that regard. And they can't charge you for normal wear and tear. There's a part of the landlord tenant handbook that describes normal wear and tear. So, for example, a hole in the wall done by a small nail to hold up a painting is normal wear and tear. A punch hole in the wall because you got mad one day at the election, whichever side you're on, that's your damage and you're going to have to pay for it. If you break something, you're going to have to pay for it. But if it's just because walking to and from the front door to the kitchen on your carpet and you've been there for a good length of time, well, that's normal wear and tear. You're not responsible for repainting the apartment when you leave. That's considered normal wear and tear. So just understand the difference. We have seen on occasion landlords who will try to keep the security deposit because they want to upgrade the appliances in the kitchen. Well, that's not your responsibility. Carlton, any thoughts on security deposits?
I mean, I'm just double checking the handbook. I mean, everything you said sounds correct to me. And good. It was a good description of, the damages that you talked about. If these are damages that you cause, obviously they're going to take that out. And but yeah, I think the handbook, from what I can see, lays that out pretty clearly.
Too many cases come in, however, of people who give up trying to get their security deposits back, and we urge you not to do that. Please file a complaint. Let us know. File a complaint with the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, and understand too that there is a penalty of a landlord who is abusive, keeps a security deposit, refuses to give it back, even if when they've broken the law, they could face up to having to pay 3 times the security deposit as a penalty back to you. So it's certainly worth standing up for your rights in that regard. Moving on to our favorite subject,
Matt,
go ahead.
can we do a couple
Sure.
questions in the
Sure.
chat? Okay. Someone just wanted to clarify about the painting. Their management told them that they no longer do that. They have about painting after 5 years. They have to. So it's not the discretion of each individual management. So if that's still happening to you, I would recommend filing a code complaint. And to do that, again, you can call 311, but I'd recommend using the online form that I put up in the chat, so that you can keep documentation of everything. And then you can also send the Renters Alliance a copy of that complaint so we can stay up to date with it.
Yeah. It would also be good, again, maybe this is going back to what Carlton said initially. It could be that the property manager or the landlord just doesn't understand the law. And so it would be a good idea to explain to them that, hey, look, this isn't at your discretion. This is required. And you ought to do it before we get into a real dispute here.
It's in the handbook, so yeah. Yes, you should try to be diplomatic first. Sorry, I jumped to the complaint. So you can show you can bring a copy of the handbook to the office and this what I understand my right to be. Are you guys able to paint it? And only if they're not willing after you show them that, then you can go to the next step.
And another thing, because that's a good point, like the laws all myself, I don't know all the law, right? I just was in court today. I heard a judge say something. I don't, that didn't reflect the law change. So it's not saying they don't know the law, right? But this is some people, it's our job to know it. And sometimes we don't know all the law. So somebody, your landlords and different things. So don't assume that you're in a position of inferiority in a lot of these interactions with folks, especially when there's law changes. When their law changes drastically and changes in any way, you see a lot of mistakes being made because people are not staying on top of that and making adjustments, and that's when you can, really spot a lot of mistakes that landlords and others are going to make when that law changes and they're not aware of it, and you are.
Emily, let's talk about our favorite subject, which is forming tenants associations.
Sure. We love tenants associations. We think every apartment, every community should have them, even if you live in a great community. There's kind of this misconception that tenant associations only happen like when there's a bad relationship with property management, but it doesn't have to be that way. When everything's going great is actually a good time to start a tenants association, not when things have already turned hostile. So this is an area where there actually are some concrete rights for renters. One of them being that tenants are allowed to form, join, meet, or assist one another with or without tenant organizations, and then to meet with their landlord through representatives that they choose, which could be us. So a lot of times, tenants aren't sure if they're allowed, if they're allowed to start organizing, if they're allowed to call us in. You are. And we can put a link in the chat of these rights as well. Another really important one is that tenant associations are allowed to have access to, if there's a community room on site, they're allowed to have access to the community room once a month for tenant meetings free of charge. And then after that, if you wanted to have a second meeting in the same month, they have to give you the same charge that they would give if you were like renting it for like a birthday party or a private party. They can't give you an extra charge just because the nature of the meeting is for the tenants association.
Emily, let me just jump in because I think the Renters Alliance deserves a little credit on that one point. This was also part of legislation that we fought for back in 2015, that it used to be that the landlord would charge you, and so these communities, $100, $200 an hour to use the community space. And it made forming tenants associations absolutely prohibitive in many, many apartment communities. So we put in the law that the landlord has to allow you to use the community space, the community facility, at no charge once a month for tenant organizing. And we think that that's gone a long way to helping tenants associations, especially in middle and lower income communities, but even upper communities that just don't want to lay out a couple $100 every time they use the facility. You also don't have to put down a security deposit to use the room either. There should be no cost to using the community facility.
And as long as you give them reasonable notice, like if you decide tonight you want to have a meeting, they have the right to say no to that. But as long as the room's not booked, next 2 Tuesdays from now we want to have a meeting, you're allowed to do that. And then another really big right for tenant organizing that we love is that tenants are allowed to freely distribute tenant organizing literature in central locations of the property, as long as you identify the origin of the literature. So you have, Gaithersburg, whatever tenant association at the top.
And also, Emily, anywhere in the building, you can do it door to door.
Door to door.
It says distribute literature freely. That means door to door, if need be, and in the community spaces of the building. Usually the rule of thumb has always been the way the management has communicated with you, you can communicate. Of course, you need to be respectful of that and not tear down, put things over their posters or leave, trashy posters around or whatever. They do have to be respectful. And you're living in a community where, people might not like certain types of literature under their doors all the time. So you have to be careful about how often you do it, but you do have that right to distribute freely and to in the community spaces.
Yeah, and so some of those spaces might be like the elevators is a really common one. Like if your management puts like upcoming parties and events in the elevator, as long as you don't cover it up, and a flyer to invite people to your tenant association meeting is perfectly fine. And if you are in a community that doesn't have a tenants association, and you're interested in starting one, you should definitely reach out to us and we can kind of give you a crash course on how to do that, what the best practices are and what to avoid. And we can attend your first couple meetings, kind of give everyone the lay of the land. And again, if you just because you're the one who kind of starts the movement doesn't mean that you naturally have to be the president or the leader. Maybe you just want to spark something and then hold officer elections, let other people take over. But yeah, please reach out to us, email or call us if you need help starting a tenants association.
Yeah, as Emily says, you don't want to wait until there's trouble to form a tenants association. It's common that people do. But the best time to get organized is when you don't need to be organized. And part of forming a tenants association too is also, as our slogan says behind us over there, building community. It's about also, people live in houses in a neighborhood. They know their neighbors. They get involved with their neighbors. People in apartment buildings are often too isolated. And we want to see people know what's going on in the rest of their building, know their neighbors. And these things can also be an opportunity for social engagement. You can have people come in, your elected officials, have them tell you what they've done for you lately and hold them accountable. You can have people come in and have a wine and cheese. You can have people come in and welcome new neighbors into the building. You can make it as much a social event, a community building event, an occasional event, as much as if there are problems in the building, a place where you can share information and act collectively. Very, very important. And we have a whole, how to form a tenants association, draft bylaws, or if you don't even want to get that organized, just how to get together and work collectively at all levels, whatever you choose to do. But we have a lot of expertise in this, and we urge this in every tenant community. Carlton,
Matt, oh,
go ahead, Emily.
There's two questions in the chat that I wanted to answer. Someone asked about requirements for landlords being available to their tenants. So their landlord had, I guess, in their leasing office has the doors locked and the shades closed all the time. And it's hard to get in contact with them. Need to defer to you, Matt. What's the requirement for
Well, right now, they
property
just
management
passed a law. Councilmember Kate Stewart championed a law which we very much supported that is requiring property managers and landlords to keep regular hours. And so if they don't keep those regular hours, then you have the basis to complain, because we've heard this in a number of places where people are having all types of trouble getting in touch with a property manager or landlord. They also have to have 24-hour access through a telephone to somebody who is managing the building.
For
And in
for
places where,
emergency.
for an emergency of some kind, that you'd be able to contact them, because we've seen a lot of allegedly 24-hour access that they get an answering machine when there's a flood in the building. And that could be a problem as well. But there is a law on the books now. We can see if we can find it, but it's just started, but we'll put more information out about that in our newsletter.
And then the last question I see right now is, where did it go? Oh, someone says that since moving in, they've had a pest control issue. They've had to throw away some appliances and are afraid to buy new ones. Should they ask the court to instruct the landlord to replace all of them? Can they break the lease? They want to know what their options are. And to that, I would say, without having all the information, if like pest issues have damaged some of your appliances, um, you know, standard procedure would be to talk to the landlord, see if they can send out their maintenance team to do a treatment and provide the necessary repairs. If they're not willing, not able, it's not going anywhere with them, I would recommend filing a code enforcement complaint, so they'll send the inspector out to take a look at the damage, and then if they see that there has been a violation of the code, they'll instruct the landlord what to do. But if it's a very serious issue, like the substantial, like very bad, like not just like a leak somewhere, but if they're like a leaky faucet wouldn't qualify for this, but like serious pest control issues, serious mold issues, that could open up grounds for you to file a rent escrow case, which is, instead of, to it's a little sidetrack, sometimes tenants, they want to withhold the rent when there's issues in the apartment, like broken appliances, pest bugs. And our advice is to never withhold the rent, even if they did not deliver the services they were promised to. You withholding the rent will just land you in failure to pay rent court. The way to combat like the landlord not delivering on the services and the repairs is to go through the court and putting your money into an escrow account, so that the court can see that you still paid rent, but the landlord is not going to receive that money until they make the necessary repairs.
Or to file a complaint with code.
Right.
And get code to come in and require them to make the repair. Don't forget, code can also cite them with fines if they don't make these repairs. And then you can also go to court and file rent escrow. But whatever you do, don't do it unilaterally and decide I'm just not going to pay the rent, because then they will come back at you for failure to pay rent, and you'll be in a much more vulnerable position. I think it's important for you people to understand what your rights are when you're facing eviction, whether it's failure to pay rent or because the landlord is claiming that you've broken the rules of the lease, or some other justification that the landlord has for trying to evict you. But there is a process in place. Our Carlton, our lawyer on the call tonight, Carlton, can you walk us through what a tenant can expect and what their rights are?
What to expect on like a failure to pay rent scenario, or
Well, the first thing is that they have to get some kind of notice. Is that right?
right. Okay, so the first step in terms, if you're at risk of eviction or either failing to pay rent, if you receive notice that you have breached the lease, etc., you're going to get some sort of notice served on to you that a complaint is coming at some point. So let's just use failure to pay rent for an example. You'll get the 10-day notice. That notice will describe, pretty much they're pretty standard, but it's gonna tell you that, hey, there's a notice, you haven't paid rent for these, this month, etc. If you do not pay within these 10 days, then we intend to file what's called a intent to file a complaint for summary ejectment, which will put you in the district court. That 10 days has to go by, then they can file the complaint. Now as a potential defense, if they try to, I've seen where the landlord filed both at the same time, a notice and a complaint, and that's going to get thrown out procedurally because they can't do that, file them at the same time. So there has to be that 10-day notice that brings you into court and says, all right, this is the action that's coming against you. And once that notice comes and they file a complaint, then at some point you will be served with a summons to appear in court. Now that summons, I gotta look to see exactly how much amount of time that you would get for each one. But the summons is going to come at some point between getting the complaint and going to court. Sometimes you might have, maybe a month. It really just depends on how quickly the court is scheduling these hearings. But usually you have a little bit of a time period that tells you here's when you're going to have to appear into court. I think. Let's see. So the next step after you're going to court, and assuming, let's just say you don't have any defenses, and the defenses that are going to get you out of it, of the failure to pay rent. At that point, failure to pay rent court is not a court where the landlord can get monetary judgments. Okay, they have to get their rent money through a different procedure. Failure to pay rent court, the district court, is for possession of the property. And what's going to be ordered at the end, if you say, hey, yeah, I do owe this amount that I have to pay, and they don't issue a stay to push the eviction out, what's going to come, either way, what's going to come is a warrant of restitution. All right, and that's where basically a fancy word to say the property is going to be restored, if you will, back to the owner. Let's see. I think, Matt, if you don't mind, I do want to, and after that point, I've been hearing in Montgomery County, and I've been trying to actually figure that out and pinpoint the time period, but the eviction, let's say it was ordered today. Right, the restitution was ordered today. The sheriff's department has to execute on the eviction. Right, they're the ones that have to come and do that work. Because of the volume of now, if you're in a really small county, they could come the next day. Right, but in this county, what I've heard anywhere from 30 to 60 days. But then I think they're moving faster now, and I think it's more so 1 week to 30 days.
So
from the
Carl,
date.
let me jump in then just on your timing,
Yeah.
because we've seen this for some years now. And I want to go back to underscore what you were talking about the 10-day notice. It used to be, we just got this passed on the state level, the 10-day notice of summary ejectment, which is a fancy term for 10 days. In 10 days, the landlord's going to file in court. So it used to be they could file immediately and you could get a summons to be in court the next day. And it was extremely unfair for people who had to take time off from work, who just, didn't see the notice until after the court date was over. It was just very brutal by landlords to file these kinds of complaints immediately and have you get into court immediately. The COVID-19 pandemic delayed court scheduling quite a bit, but it used to be they could get you into court right away, and it was very unfair to tenants. So we instituted a law, the Renters Alliance was one of the champions of this, to give you 10-day notice. So it's a form that looks very scary, and maybe that's a good idea. In 10 days, we're going to file against you in court for eviction. And many people receive that on day 2 if your rent's not paid on the first day of the month. It could be that they don't give it to you later in the month, but landlord has a right to give it to you on the second day of the month if you didn't pay your rent on the first day, if they're going to go after you for failure to pay rent. Then, as Carlton points out, you have to show up to court. We urge everybody to go to court. And then if there is a judgment against you for failure to pay rent, then the landlord will file, as Carlton points out, what's called a writ of restitution. And that is basically the landlord saying, yeah, I want the property back. Then that goes to the sheriff's department, and the sheriff's department schedules, and it could technically be the next day, but it's usually 2 weeks to 6 weeks or longer. And the sheriff will come out to your house and put a notice on your door that's called a red and white. And that very scary notice says, we're coming. So get ready, either pay off what you owe if it's failure to pay rent, or get ready to move out. And I want to underscore something, Carlton, which I'm sure you agree with, that no one can evict you without a court order. So a landlord cannot do it themselves. They cannot change the locks. They cannot reduce your services. They cannot move your furniture out. They can't do anything until that judgment was made in court, and they are accompanied by a sheriff with a court order to evict you from your apartment. Does that sound right, Carlton?
Absolutely. And then the eviction takes place if for failure to pay rent, if you pay before the sheriff comes, and that ends it, and you will not be evicted. And it won't go on your record.
Now, the only caveat to that is if you've had 3 judgments against you in a 12-month period, and then the landlord files, they have to file this, a foreclosure of right of redemption. I think that's what it's called, which means you didn't, this is the fourth judgment, and even I'm not going to allow you to pay and stay. I want you out, but they've got to file that.
That's a good catch. And I think, Montgomery is 3. There's other counties. I think Baltimore County might be 5, but or Prince George, if I'm not mistaken, but Montgomery is 3. But what I want to do before we go on from the call is give you as I'm sitting in the court today, and again, new to Maryland law and just observing things, I think it's helpful to give you some practical information that I think is really going to help a lot of tenants, going to help a lot of people, and it's a lesson that all of us actually need to learn regardless of our walks of life. I just kind of wrote down some brief points. All right, one thing you want to do is consider yourself in all your affairs that you go out and do like a business. All right, and what all businesses should be doing is documenting everything. All right, it's tedious to do that. It might not be your natural inclination to do, but you want to make sure that you document everything. So what do I mean? The second point, right, and this kind of goes along with the first, the written word is king, all right, or queen, or whatever monarchy you want to put in place, all right? The written word cannot be changed, right? It is fixed. It is stamped on. Now, well, it can be changed, but just follow me. It cannot be changed. It's fixed. So when you are looking at the chain of how you want to interact with a landlord, your employer, somebody you're doing business with, email, right? /text / something that's down in writing, because you want to be able to reference back to it. Because obviously you all know in a conversation, It's a game of telephone. Or I can just simply say, if there's no record of the conversation, I never talked to you. All right. And as it comes of no surprise, in my career, obviously in my life, police lie, tenants lie, everybody's lies. All right. So it's like you want to have things written down. So as you're interacting with your landlord, if it's something important, I would email them if they have an email address that's available, or email somebody, the property manager, and keep that email chain flowing. And know, regardless of if you have a conversation with them, right, on a pass by that's about something important, go back to, when you get settled, go back and email and reference per our conversation that we just had on XYZ date. I want to confirm whatever it is that you want to confirm. So you want to have that document everything. You want to not go further into that, but just remember, if you don't remember anything else, written word is key. Get everything documented, and it might feel like you're ruining the relationship, but remember, this is a business relationship. All right, and it, with your friends, don't do that. All right, because then you won't have too many friends. But with stuff outside of personal relationships, written word is the king. As you are doing that documentation, right, particularly like with failure to pay rent, the landlord's supposed to keep a ledger. You keep a ledger. I've seen too many people, they don't know what they paid. And I understand, look, life gets hectic. Sometimes you're making partial payments. Sometimes you're doing what you can just to kind of get by. Things are going crazy. You're not keeping record. But if you can remember to do so and be disciplined enough to do so, keep your own ledger. Keep track of who you've paid, what you've paid, and what dates you've paid. And I can even create, hopefully in the future, create some sort of document that can be passed around that can just kind of give you a model and help you to use that, because that's what's going to help you to combat their ledger. All right. And sometimes the landlord doesn't have a good ledger. Speeding to the end, I would say, again, if you're preparing for court, organize all your evidence. All right. So as you're documenting these things, you're having these emails, or as you start to do that. But if it's a rent escrow, right, and you're saying I have rodents everywhere, take pictures of the rodents. Take pictures of the damage that the rodents are doing. If you have text message exchanges with the landlord, print that out. Emails, print all that stuff out, have it all organized in reverse chronological order from the most current dating back to however long the issue occurs. All right. Because let's see, know your lease. All right. So keep your lease, the full lease, study it, pull it out every month if you want to, and just go through the terms so that you're really, really familiar and that you know it cold. And then the fifth point, don't wait, mitigate. All right. Mitigate your damages. What I mean is, when something is wrong, get on it immediately. Don't wait for it to get out of control. Don't wait for too much time to go by. You want to stay on top of it, and to the extent possible, even if the landlord is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's not going to help you for you to just throw your hands up and say, I'm not going to do what I need to do. You have to take on a posture of, I'm going to do everything that I'm supposed to do right and keep all of my stuff in order, so that even if they are doing wrong, I'm mitigating that damage, and I'm not letting things go out of control. Because when you show up in failure to pay rent court and you say, well, I didn't pay the rent because the landlord didn't do X, Y, and Z, if you don't have any evidence, if you don't have all this stuff in order, it's really going to be they're going to lean more towards the landlord. Just naturally. That's almost everywhere you go. It's very a favor towards landowners. So that's those are all kind of practical things. So again, if you don't remember anything, the most important thing I would say is, do not interact with people informally, your landlords. Have everything written, email if possible. If text message is all you got, send them, just written stuff. All right. And when it's verbal, go back and confirm with the written word, because that's what locks it in. That's what you can go back to, and that's what's credible. And then the very, very, very last thing, as I said earlier, think about what you want out of these. You know, when you're making a decision of, am I going to go to court or not? You know, there's the short term, right, or of taking an action, and then there's kind of the long term that you need to think about, particularly in a relationship that in a lease could be a year, could be 2 years, or is, you know, this might be someplace you want to stay. You know, you might be in a marriage you don't like you can't just leave a marriage. You gotta work, you gotta figure out how to work it out. You know, and if it gets to a point where it can't be worked out, then you bring in somebody to help you, and then, you know, you go through that process. But you want to take as hard as it can be, and emotions get involved into it. But if you can remove yourself from the short-term emotion, just think about what you really want, right? I've been in a position where I've had to file my own legal actions about stuff that happened to me, and I did it not for money, but because I wanted to let them know that you can't just do anything you want to me, which is the last point. All of these processes, right? Sometimes all you have to do is put forth just a little bit of resistance, right? Just a little bit of resistance can cause a change a lot of times, because the system, and I'm just using that broadly, a lot of these systems are not used to people pushing back. That's what makes having an attorney in court, you know, good for you. That's what helps having an advocate for you. They're not used to people advocating. They're used to just people saying, I don't want to deal with it. I'm just going to accept whatever it is. And when you do that, that you get what comes with that, and you just get rolled, and you'll get rolled forever. So you
enable abusive landlords and a bad system.
Yeah.
You know, Carlton, I really want to thank you and appreciate what you're telling everybody, especially about the business relationship that one has with the landlord. They would not lease the apartment to you without something in writing. That's called a lease. And the same thing goes in the other direction. If you need something, you can be friendly, you can be informal with them, but when it comes to the business, get it in writing. So we're out of time, but I really want to thank Carlton Martin from the Homeless Persons Representation Project. We did not cover every right that you have. We did not cover every part of the law. This is an ongoing conversation. We will return to it again periodically, as is our role in helping to educate renters about rights and responsibilities, and to advocate for more rights in Montgomery County and in the state and beyond. I want to thank our patient and paying attention staff, Pat Beckham, Malek Demir, our treasurer who keeps an eye on our money and makes sure we spend it the right way, Josh Fisher, and of course, our outreach coordinator, Emily Towie, for her growing expertise in the field of landlord-tenant law, but especially back to Carlton Martin. Thank you for joining us. We know you've had a long day in court, and you've got cases to take care of, and we hope we can have you back sometime in the future to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and I'll be glad to come back. Take care.
Thank you, Carlton. And with everybody else, thank you. Send your questions or concerns to us if we haven't addressed them to info@rentersalliance.org or to the 888 number that is in the chat. And with that, thank you, everybody, and good night.